Hey everybody, welcome to Little Owl Psychology. I wanted to start this video off with a little intro where I speak to you a bit. I'm so excited to release this episode. It was a very enlightening conversation, and I really love so much of the wording and phrasing that Jordan uses, and you can really see like how she has developed such an incredible depth of self-awareness by the way she's able to articulate these particular issues and situations that happen in relationships that I'm incredibly appreciative of. I was a little nervous to start because I just was so overwhelmed because I have known her Instagram platform for a bit now, and her posts have helped me so much. So in the beginning I was kind of like a little excited, a little nervous, but I do get myself together and it's a great conversation. So please enjoy, and don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to Alchemist Discussions. I am so honored today to have Jordan Dann on my channel for this week's Alchemist Discussions. So Jordan is a psychoanalyst based in New York who specializes in Imago relationship therapy, gestalt therapy, and somatic experiencing. She works with individuals as well as couples, and her Instagram platform is mostly dedicated to understanding relationship issues and conflict. Jordan is also an educator, a writer. I've read like almost all of your articles, and a wedding officiant. And we connected through her beautiful Instagram platform because I tend to share almost every post you make, which, by the way, I love the art of it as well, like not just your words, but it's like beautifully curated. So I really appreciate that.
Thanks for saying so.
Of course. All right, so first question is, I want to start off by asking, like, what brought you to practicing psychoanalysis and going specifically into, Imago and gestalt therapy and somatic experiencing? Like, what brought you to wanting to study that specifically?
So I'm just so excited to be here with you and have this dialogue with you. So thank you for the invitation. My first passion and my first career was in the theater. And so the way I've come to understand my biography is that my love of theater really originated out of a psychological impulse, just given my familial history and also just my temperament and who I was, very sensitive with wonderful, to the best of their ability, parents who were also, pretty self-absorbed. I really needed help understanding the world and understanding who I was, and theater was really a place that allowed that to happen. I feel like just not only the being in the theater, of course, just is an opportunity to immerse oneself in different worlds, to get inside the body and experience of different characters, but it's also a kind of atmosphere of expedited intimacy, of closeness that just happens as a result of the kind of timeline of production. And so that was the first iteration of my life. I was a performer and I was in a band for a long time, and then actually did an MFA in theater education with a focus on Linklater voice technique, which is it's a voice technique specifically for freeing the body from extraneous tension to provide maximum freedom for self-expression. Kristen Linklater created this technique specifically to support with actors learning to work on classical text. And there are elements the concept in this work is that voice is self. And so that in of itself is a very psychological, theoretical framework. And as I was doing my MFA and started working with training actors, I was working with the body and discovering now in retrospect, I can understand this. And I think I knew to some degree at the time, but really encountering unprocessed trauma and being very deep in a psychological process with another person. And really loving that aspect of the experience and feeling more and more like this, like, now we have to now put it on the text, or now apply it to this scene. And that started to feel like I wasn't interested in that part, and I just wanted to stay with the psychological process. And fast forwarding, that led me to thinking, okay, so now time for a career change. And I worked with a gestalt therapist, and the theory and her way of working felt very akin to the language that I understand experientially in theater. Gestalt has a lot of, it's a process-oriented therapy. It's an experiential therapy, and that had a very similar qualities to the atmosphere of theaters, of an experimental theater space. And certainly the focus on somatic work was really, really something that I loved and came from, and Gestalt very much works with the body. So that's what brought me to Gestalt. And then, as I was doing my clinical training, I was working with lots of individuals, and then I worked with my first couple. And it was a couple that it was an amazing experience to be inside the world of their relationship, to help them understand what they needed, how they were kind of, where they were stopping themselves from connecting. And so that really kind of lit the fire for my interest in working with couples. And also, I would say, certainly over the past 15 years in my own process of therapy, I've just witnessed in my marriage how much my self-work has benefited my ability to be in relationship, and how much more joyful, satisfying, peaceful my relationship has become. And I think, even with respect to my Instagram, I started my Instagram because I kind of felt like this is an Instagram. My Instagram is for like my 18-year-old self. And if I had the kind of knowledge and training then, what kinds of relationships I could have avoided, and how I could have been different in those relationships.
Incredible. I relate to a lot of what you said, because even the work that I do online, I try to think like my younger self, what would she have so benefited from knowing what I know now, so maybe another person doesn't have to go through the mistakes that I went through. And so, yeah, even just some, I'm 27, about to turn 28, and even reading your posts now, I'm like, oh my gosh, it helps me so much to just read through it, and also realize things in this moment, and think about, I'm like, wow, 10 years ago, had I known this, the people I would have avoided, and the situations too. So I wanted to ask you also, so Imago relationship therapy, could you explain that a little bit? So I know gestalt and somatic has to do with moving with the body and discovering sensations in the body to access where trauma has been held. So how does that relate to Imago relationship therapy too?
Yeah, each of these modalities has so many connections. And I would say, somatic experiencing and gestalt, there's so many overlaps. What I love about somatic experiencing is it's really just focused on the body, on the nervous system, and it's so rooted in science, which I love. Imago relationship therapy. Imago is translated from Latin to image. Also, I just think imagistically, an imago is also the chrysalis before a butterfly emerges is called an imago. And the theoretical underpinnings of imago are really taken from object relations theory, attachment theory, which is that we have a blueprint, a template inside of us from our earliest attachment experiences with our primary caregivers, and that we then carry this image, imago, into our lives, and we are attracted to individuals who contain both the positive and the negative attributes of our primary caregivers, but mainly the negative ones.
Yeah.
Because really, from the way I see this is so strength-based. We're such beautiful creatures, that this seeking out of getting what we never received, this seeking out of really even recreating a familiar, albeit sometimes deeply frustrating or even traumatic, is our way of healing. I think, Freud would disagree. The repetition, well, probably not if he were alive today, but the repetition compulsion can, I think, sometimes be seen as a kind of a negative, but it's really when you align with the experience, such a beautiful impulse inside of us that we are looking to heal that which is unhealed or finish what is unfinished. And so Imago kind of is an exploration with couples, really shuttling between present circumstances, shuttling between the dynamic of the relationship and their history, and really helping couples to build primarily through Imago dialogue, which is I really see it as kind of a sacred relational practice of helping couples to develop metacognition and mentalization. So their ability to have thoughts about, to be able to make connections between what happened in the past and what's getting recreated right now, as well as their capacity to be aware of their state of mind and of their partner's state of mind.
That's so beautiful. And I think it's interesting because even in my experience, the past coming up has been seen as this negative thing in relationships. And I feel as I've gotten older, I'm wait a second, I'm we all have this, all of this is being inflamed and brought up in relationships, and we can see relationships as an opportunity to heal and evolve, and you said, this kind of almost innate desire to heal and to, I guess, get our needs met, even if it comes up negatively.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to know what your thoughts are on the honeymoon stage. So I feel this stage is very romanticized, but I'm starting to see it as quite a fantasy and an illusion, but I'd like to know what you think about it.
Am I allowed to ask what you think first?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
So I guess my ideas about the honeymoon stage are like, I recently read it's like the inner child fantasy stage. And I was like, oh, I've never heard that phrasing before. But for me, I guess it makes a lot of sense. I think like you meet a person and you don't really know them yet. So initially you kind of meet your projections of them. And so over time, um, those projections, those fantasies start to, come to ground, and you start to see, oh, this is another flawed human being just like me, and here we are co-creating something, and it's not realistic to project some maybe kind of perfection or just pure bliss and happiness onto a person, because eventually you have to come back down to earth. So I guess that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, I'm really appreciating that organization and description, and I concur. I think the honeymoon phase or the romantic phase is delicious.
Yeah.
And time sensitive. And I think, it certainly, this is what I use with couples, these two little foam balls to illuminate emotional symbiosis, which is when you said inner child fantasy. The romantic phase is very much a state of emotional symbiosis. You and I are one, we are one, we want the same things, we have the same impulses. Oh my gosh, you were going to say that? I was going to say that. And I think it's important to hold the complexity of the romantic stage, because it is delicious. And it is actually really, there's so, just from a neurochemical standpoint, there's higher levels of oxytocin, and we're on a high from the feeling of initial connection. And sex obviously also deepens and increases the chemicals that that move through our body.
Right.
And it's important for bonding that to have, when I work with couples, in our first meeting, we touch on what brought you together. And that the story of coming together is the relationship mythology, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And also, that kind of wonder of, wow, here we are, like the possibility of even having a human life in the first place, if you ever contemplate on that, is just
amazing.
Impossible. It's impossible.
Yeah, that's true.
To be alive and have a human experience is just wow.
Yeah.
And to then be able to share it with another person is equally impossible and awe-inspiring. So I think the meditation of how people come together is just, it's so sacred. I think that's part of why I love being an officiant too, is being able to be in that kind of mythology of another couple. And also, I think we need to know that, oh, this is what's happening now, and it's going to change.
Yeah.
And at some point, when the projection of you being my total gratifying other or parent pops, when that bubble pops, and you become real to me and I become more real to you, isn't that beautiful too?
Mm-hmm.
And can we move more into the complexities and the reality of accepting each other's differences, as opposed to continuing, because the power struggle is almost always an issue of emotional symbiosis. When we're differentiated, I can tell you about my need, but I don't, and I can feel healthily entitled to your response, but I certainly don't believe that you'll know it.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually need to be able to accept that you might not be able to meet my need.
Mm-hmm.
So many, you know, when you see individuals who move from relationship to relationship, it's like often someone who is just moving from romantic phase to romantic phase.
Yes.
And not accepting the reality that a relationship is something much, much more complex and actually much richer if you hang out and you learn to do the relating in a new way.
Yes, I recently heard Esther Perel say a lot of people have a lot of love stories, but not a life story.
Mm-hmm.
I heard that before, and like when I heard her say that, I was like, wow, okay, I've never heard that phrasing, but it's beautiful and true. So I wanted to ask you as well, so emotional symbiosis, would you say it's kind of similar to like emotionally enmeshment? Like the enmeshment, is it similar to that?
Yeah, I see emotional symbiosis as kind of like a infantile state. It's what, from a healthy standpoint, happens with a baby and a mother, right? I I cry and the breast is there. Like it's just you. If I'm your child, you have a complete attunement and kind of omnipotent ability to meet my needs and be one with me.
Okay.
And yeah, and I think probably you could, from like a more popular standpoint, you could think of emotional symbiosis as like codependency or just low relatedness.
Okay.
But it really is often a defensive structure, or sometimes just a lack of understanding of a willingness and an ability to really know that I am a separate person from you.
Yeah.
And as I even say that, I just feel in my own body how I'm sitting back and I'm like more aware of you now, even as I just say that.
Right. I read your article, which was awesome, on, I think, Mind Body Green, is that the name of the website? And it was on the dance between independence and interdependence. And I guess we're talking about it now, is like, what do you think makes that so difficult? Like being able to say, like, I'm a different person than you, and you're your own person, and like that's okay. So I guess, like, what do you think makes that so hard? And like, what are some practical ways people can kind of dance that dance more gracefully?
That's a wonderful question. I'm going to come to you again too, to hear what your thoughts are about that.
So I think what makes it so difficult is, like, as you said, the emotional symbiosis. And I think that emotional symbiosis is like so saturated in media and glorified as like that's how relationships are. Like you should feel like they get you, they read your mind, they like intuit your feelings. And so I feel like there's this curated idea of love and media that people are so like under that spell. So then when it comes to being in an actual relationship, like we're not taught like, hey, like you need to communicate your needs effectively and like let the person know, like, I don't like this, can you do this? So I feel like we're kind of taught to set up our relationships for failure by expecting these things. And I think like that expectation makes it harder to be differentiated, because you're like, oh, I thought you should know my needs, I have to tell you my needs. So I feel like that kind of, and I think being able to know what your needs are could be a practical way to dance more gracefully, knowing how to communicate that. So yeah, I guess that's what I think of it so far.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think romanticism has had a really unfortunate impact on so much of how we view relationships.
So,
Um, I think some of what happens, I mean, a lot of emotional symbiosis is actually also just related to, either attachment trauma in some respects. And by attachment trauma, I mean, I don't, even in securely attached individuals, we have had formative, repetitive instances of how we've been related to. So this kind of recurrent frustrations and needs not being met can also play a part in emotional symbiosis. And I think in subtle ways that the way that plays out is, if I had a mother who didn't listen to me and who didn't really pay attention, my husband is not my mother. I know that that's so could be considered a slightly advanced skill, and I mean that seriously. Um, um, and so my just even in my body, if from a nervous system standpoint, if he's on his phone, or if he's not doesn't have the capacity to attend to me in a way that makes me feel really listened to,
yeah.
the slightest threat can alert my sense of safety. And that state of frustration is I'm gonna move through all the well-trod neurological pathways and the stories and the evidence that that's the case. And I lose sight in that moment of the reality of who my partner is. I lose sight of even the capacity to really understand that, to hold the fact that he does listen most of the time, but he can't listen all of the time, and that's okay. And so that's kind of a subtle moment of emotional symbiosis too, is really when I lose the reality of the acceptance of the otherness of my partner, and I'm in some kind of more self-absorbed experience that has more to do with my history than with the present reality.
Yes, absolutely. So I've had the experience often where I have been like aware. I'm like, okay, I'm triggered because there's like this thing from my past, or this person did this. And I've had people say like, I'm not your ex-boyfriend, and like scream and get really upset, like, I'm not your ex-boyfriend. And I'm also guilty of saying like, I'm not your ex-girlfriend, like kind of saying that. And I wanted to ask, like, that's definitely not a great way of like dealing with that. So like, when your partner's past is being triggered, what would you say is like maybe a better response than saying like, hey, I'm not your ex, because I don't think that works.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think so much of being in committed long-term partnership is the capacity to hold our partner's history. The more work that a couple has done together, the more work that if they've done work in their own therapy, or if they just have this awareness already, they can say to their partner, oh, they can take personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
When this behavior happens, the story I tell myself is where this takes me is my reactive behavior is, and the more I can share with you and own what happens when you are, do, etc., the less defensive you have, the more space there is for you to go, oh, this isn't about me.
Mm-hmm.
And the more space there is actually then for you to stay regulated. Because if in partnership, if one person can stay regulated, there's a better chance that you can both come back to some regulation. And so I think in response to your question, you know, I think in an ideal world, this isn't always possible, but in the moments where if I'm in an activated state, I've lost access to my prefrontal cortex, I'm in my amygdala, and all of that awareness is gone because I'm just in, you know, fight, flight, freeze. Yeah. But where you can say in that moment is, you know, you can mirror, this is why I love Imago dialogue. You can mirror me, you can just validate, like, you seem really upset right now. Like, and I'm wondering if, you know, what I did reminded you of, or, you know, if there's a way to sense into holding my history for me. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that depends on the kind of shorthand that is available with a couple. Sometimes it's just mirroring, like, you seem really upset. Yeah, I can hear how hurtful that was, or, you know, and your non-defensiveness and your ability to stay with me can actually let me come back to some regulation. Now, that's in an ideal state. Yeah. Sometimes if there's too much activation, you might be in danger, your boundaries might be threatened. And so then taking a pause, taking a break, saying, let's come back to this in a little bit after there's been some down regulation and there's more capacity to dialogue in a less reactive way. Yeah. Because nothing can go well when people are in a state of activation.
No. Yeah, definitely not. It's just like, I was reading that there's like this negative cycle loop, you know, when both people are activated and you just feed into it, and it's so hard to kind of like step out of that, and then that cycle is then, you know, what really hurts the couple.
Yeah, and that cycle can then become the dynamic. Mm-hmm. You know, I guess I have a little bit of a personal mission about depathologizing codependence.
Yes, I read one of your posts, and like, so I go to Coda because like I think I have such an issue with codependency, and I read your post and I was like, huh, okay. I was like, it made me think about it a little bit more. So yeah, I did want to like talk to you about that too.
What shifted for you in kind of reflecting?
So for years now, because I've been in Coda for like 5 years, I've really seen codependency as such an issue of mine. And I'm like, okay, like I gotta like get a good like hold on this. But I think as like, after I read your post and amongst like other things I've read too, I'm like, maybe there are elements of codependency that I think are, you know, unhealthy. But maybe there are things that we've deemed as codependent that are maybe normal, and maybe we're calling these things codependency, but they're not codependency. It's something else, and we've kind of just put codependency under this like umbrella topic where things are underneath it that could actually be called something else and handled differently. So yeah.
And so what is your definition of codependence?
So I would say my definition of codependency is I guess in a sense, it's like really drowning in that emotional symbiosis. In a sense, it's like drowning in the other so much that you really lose your sense of self, and drowning so much in the other person that you lose sight of like your needs, and you lose sight of keeping a self intact. So I guess that's kind of how I would define it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the image of drown. I mean, I don't like it, but it's a useful image of drowning. And let me ask you another question as kind of the ground. How do you understand someone learns to be codependent or becomes codependent?
So I think that it can be from a few things. I think one is like growing up in like a dysfunctional family system where your emotional needs were not met as a child, or just severely not met, like maybe 40% of the time. Um, I also think it could come from being raised by someone who is very self-absorbed. Um, I think it could come from also maybe feeling like there's a lot of chaos around you as a kid, so not wanting to add to that chaos, so kind of putting your needs, your issues on the back burner. I also think it could come from like a religious conditioning, just this supreme selflessness. And I also think as women, we're taught to be very selfless, so conditioning as a woman. Although I do see a lot of men who are codependent, so not sure how much that plays a role, but I think, yeah, it's an element of like family system dynamic, trauma, and just conditioning in various ways.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I'm appreciating you offering the nuances of environment in that respect. Um, yeah, so I think let's start with the first example of if if my needs have not been met, or if, in either respect, that there's not, someone didn't have the capacity or was too self-absorbed or lacking in attunement to notice what my needs were, that my belief becomes I have to drown myself, or like my needs don't matter, diminishment, perhaps even an obscuring and not knowing what my needs are, and a kind of internalized belief that in order to be safe, in order to be connected, I have to prioritize you over myself.
Yes.
And so here's the starting point, which is, I think we have to then have a new healing relational experience wherein we learn to depend on another person.
Mm-hmm.
And by that I mean, I couldn't even illustrate all of it, but that I start to discover, oh, you bring me comfort.
Mm-hmm.
I can, this is a safe harbor.
Yeah.
You help me clarify my needs. You're curious about my needs.
Mm-hmm.
You're invested in helping me get my needs met. And one could say, ooh, that's dependent. Yes.
Yeah.
And the more confident and secure and trusting I become in your consistency, your reliability, your accessibility to me, the more independent I become.
Yeah.
The more able I am to need you, the more accessible you are, the more my needs are met, the less, the more kind of fortified in a self concept I become, insofar as like my self-world construct changes. Oh, the world is a place where I can be a person with needs and people want to meet my needs. Mm-hmm. And I would even say, and sometimes they don't get met, and I live and I can survive. Or I recalibrate and I go someplace else where my need can be met by another person. Yeah. And that interdependence allows for greater independence. Yeah. Because I think there's so much, especially in Western culture, like this kind of glorification of independence and kind of over parentification. Maybe not so much anymore, but certainly as a child, of the 80s, like latchkey kids, like do it all by yourself, like what a painfully lonely and unhealthy way to be in the world. Like, just even from a health standpoint, there's so much research that the individuals with the strongest immune systems that live the longest are those that are deeply connected in relationships in community. Yeah. So, I think depending on others is deeply healthy. Yeah. It's the quality of what that dependence is like, and as you said, not a drowning, but like, I'm here as a full self, and so are you, and we meet in this space in between.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you for how you described it. It was so beautiful. I felt like calm as you were describing it. And I think it's like, I think we're taught that on some level, as you said, I do think there is still some hyper dependence in our culture, a little bit of a glorification of that. And I think, like, at least, and even for me in my life, there's been points where I've almost felt like that hyper independence, there's like a safety in that, like, oh, I don't have to open up, I don't have to be vulnerable, I don't have to deal with all of that. But like you said, if you're able to create something with someone that is so beautiful, where you're able to both be different people and, like, meet each other's needs most of the time, like, it could elevate that independence of, like, well, like, this is my experience in the world now as an individual person, where I depend on someone in a healthy way, and like, they reflect back to me, like, that I'm great, and I'm lovable, and I'm loving. And so I can see that being, yeah, a way to, yeah, highlight that.
If you take it back to just like attachment and early development, are you familiar with the strange experiment, Mary Ainsworth?
The strange, oh, maybe if you tell me a little bit about it.
I'm pretty sure this is part of Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby's work, but in early attachment research, what kind of the experiment that gets set up is with, groups of children and the accessibility of the maternal, it's mostly mothers, but, the caregiver's presence. So, if my child is in a room full of other children playing, and I'm attuned and focused and available and kind of being with the child will explore further out, go further out, play with other kids, go play with other toys, and then keep coming back to check in on the secure base, really from a standpoint of like regulating the nervous system. If the mother is distracted, unavailable, not present, the child won't go explore. They'll stay close, they'll often be agitated, and no exploration into the world can happen. Wow. So if you think about that from an adult standpoint too, it's like, that's in the reparative relationship. If you can have the continued repeated experience that I'm here, I'm steady, I'm predictable, I'm responsive, you get to go further out, and with a feeling of safety.
Yeah.
If you've overcoupled safety with never leaving, then that's codependent.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that element of control, because I also think in codependency, control is like one of the main ingredients per se. And like when you were talking, I was thinking about like, oh yeah, in relationships where control becomes such a thing, you don't feel like that freedom to explore and come back to a safe space. It feels like really contained and like, okay, I can't explore because if I do, then I'll come back to the space and you'll be upset and, you know, etc. So that makes so much sense. If you could name one tool, and I know there's so many great tools, but if you can name one tool that you think is the best to bring into conflict, what would it be and why?
Accept the reality that your partner is not you.
Mm, yeah. And I feel like we kind of just explained why. Yeah, absolutely.
It's really like a mantra, especially when I notice reactivity in myself. It's just like, you know, even this morning I had a little moment of activation with my husband, and I came back to that as this kind of statement to myself, you know, Keith is not you. He's not, he's not intentionally doing this thing to upset you. You're having an experience about who he is, and how can you communicate that to him in the most open, loving way, without, while you own your own shit.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I went to him and I was able to just, I mean, it's like I'm kind of kept, not to say I have moments where all of this work we're talking about is not available to me, and I'm very much in a kind of deeply activated, very emotionally immature place. So I feel like that's really important to say, is that's part of why I am so committed to this work, because I'm still learning it for myself. But when I have these moments of like, wow, this is like, I can often see when I notice reactivity and I'm able to really hold myself and work with myself. It's almost like I can see, you know, it's like the Matrix, like I can see two different versions. There's the version where I'm able to really be in my highest self and my emotional maturity and my ability to accept my partner's difference and also communicate what's important to me in a very measured way. And then we just do that and the day goes on. Then there's another version where I let reactivity take over. I get really activated. I character assassinate him. He gets defensive, and then I have to sit in the emotional hangover and then find a way to come back and repair.
Wow. Love the wording of emotional hangover. That is so real.
So I just had this moment today. I went to him and I said, you know, when X behavior happens, I notice my reactive behavior, where that takes me is I get anxious. And the story I tell myself is blah, blah, blah. And what I'm really needing from you is X in those moments. And he mirrored me, and then that was that. I'll just end by saying the 5 things that I think are crucial for relationship. The first one being accept the reality that your partner is not you. The second is advocate for your partner's separate reality and potential.
So advocating, that would mean like being curious about your partner's reality and
certainly curious, and at times that can even be advocating, like, you know, my husband, you know, my husband and I have kind of just very different temperaments. When I work with couples, sometimes I have an puppets, an alligator and a turtle. He's more of a turtle in terms of his own history in an early environment and his own temperament. He's more likely to withdraw, to kind of clam up. He doesn't communicate as readily, whereas I'm more of the kind of alligator, where I'm like, I think of myself as, you know, the one who takes care of the relationship, the one that really cares about things, the one that easily expresses my emotional experience. And at first that was very painful, but now I can go, yeah, you seem like you might need a little space right now. Like, that's advocate. First it starts with curiosity, then probably acceptance, and then you can start to advocate.
Okay. Like being able to know, like, now I know this is your style, you know, of conflict or of, you know, dealing with your emotions. So I'm seeing, do you need this? Like, is that kind of?
Yeah. Or even like, you're so social and you really get so much from connecting with people. I don't, but it's not a threat to me if you do that. Like, yes, go out, have fun. I can't wait to see you later at home.
Yeah.
The third is make your relationship a sacred space by removing negativity and criticism. I really think this commitment to, like, an exacting commitment to the sacredness of language, the real attunement to how I say things in a way that doesn't hurt my partner is so crucial.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Always honor your partner's boundaries is number 4. And practicing Imago dialogue, or practicing some kind of a communication practice, like having some tenets, groundwork of like, this is how we move through conflict.
Yeah.
And I would even say, and this is how we communicate the depth of intimacy or care for each other, that there's a real practice. Like, I think about this so often on a session, like that, you know, we commit to fitness practice or health or a diet, but like, how often being super intentional about how we are in relationship can get left out. And, you know, just like fitness, it's like, if you work out daily and you attend to your body, then you really can, recover more easily, or not get sick as often, or not come to the end of the year and think, oh, I don't feel good in my body, and now I have to kind of do this a triage. Like, if we do this kind of really intentional work with being in relationship, then the relationship thrives.
Yeah.
But I think we often come with this, again, this presupposition that it's supposed to just be easy.
Right. Yeah, like, oh, this person's just your soulmate and that's it, and it should be perfect, and if it's not, then you're not meant to be together. And all that wording. What would you say is the ultimate red flag? And like I know that that's like thrown around so much now, but I think maybe there's still something to be said about it. Like if there is an element of someone's character, you're like, that's going to be really difficult to work with if you do see certain quality.
That's just such a hard question to answer because it's so different for different people, dependent upon their own histories and dependent upon their style.
Yeah, I love you're answering it this way, by the way. Appreciate it because I feel like people make these posts on Instagram, they're like red flags, and it's like they number it, and I'm like, but it doesn't leave room for nuance, right? And complexity in people's character, and why are they doing this? And yeah.
Yeah, so I guess more than even like in our alignment about not wanting to be prescriptive here. I think what I would say is more than a red flag in someone else, I would bring it back to the individual and say like the most important thing in a relationship is really paying attention to your experience and noticing what's pleasant, what feels good, and what doesn't feel good. And taking seriously and really being curious about what doesn't feel good, as opposed to, as opposed to some of the understandable defensive responses that might come in, which is, this person will change, or I can overlook this, or I can kind of like do with less. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. That's such a beautiful way and to answer that question. And I think I agree with it so much because everybody has such an individual experience.
And what I might not be able to tolerate in a relationship, you might not even bother you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for finding me and for inviting me to spend this time with you.
Yeah, I'm so honored. My friend actually showed me your profile and then I was like, oh, so very like blessed to have like found your profile and now to have a conversation with you.
Well, I look forward to staying connected.
Me too.